You are listening to ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.
Hello, this is Paul Washington, Executive Director of the Environmental, Social, and Governance Center here at the Conference Board. The ESG Center focuses on helping companies define and fulfill their evolving role in society by providing timely and relevant insights for what's ahead in the areas of corporate governance, sustainability, and citizenship. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about the relationship between corporate directors and shareholders, specifically focusing on when it makes sense for members of a corporate board to have direct conversations with their shareholders. For many years, the traditional model, in the US at least, was for management to handle basically all communications with shareholders. Sure, directors sometimes would mingle with shareholders at the annual shareholders meeting, and there were other times where board members would meet directly with activist investors and others. But direct conversations between board members and shareholders was really the exception and certainly not the rule. But that's clearly changing. And to discuss what's happening, why it's happening, and how companies and investors both can make the most of the discussions between shareholders and directors, I'm thrilled to be joined by Bill Ultan, who is Managing Director at Morrow Sodali, a global corporate advisory firm that provides clients with advice and services relating to, among other things, corporate governance, ESG, proxy solicitation, shareholder and bondholder engagement, activism, and other contested situations, and then some. Bill is founder of the corporate governance consulting group at the firm, and he's got over 35 years of experience in guiding companies through a whole range of governance challenges and opportunities. So Bill, I am thrilled to spend time with you. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Paul, for that generous introduction. I don't feel that old, but I'll take it. So,
well, it's a podcast, so no one can tell what either of us look like.
That's right.
You don't look that old either. Well, look, let's start off with the state of play in terms of director shareholder engagement. You know, what companies are doing it? How prevalent is the practice? And you know, what are the main topics that they're talking about to the extent they are having these discussions? So give us a sort of picture of the current state of play, if you would.
Sure. So I would say over the last few years, director engagement, and to be clear, we're talking about independent director engagement, has become somewhat the norm for larger cap companies. And I can get into the reasons for that in a moment. Smaller and mid-cap companies, it's still not the norm, but I expect it'll be happening with a little more regularity in the years ahead. For large cap companies, the reason it's become more regular is stemming from the challenges around shareholder proposals, say on pay, that large cap companies tend to be the primary targets of. And it's become important for shareholders to hear the voice of the board and the independent oversight of the board. The conversations are different than they are with management. Shareholders don't expect directors to be the subject matter experts on a range of ESG topics, but they want to understand how the board goes about its oversight responsibilities. And so hearing directly from them is a way of informing the shareholders and allowing the shareholders to assess their portfolio risk. It also provides an opportunity for the companies and the boards to establish credibility, establish relationships with these key shareholders. For smaller and mid-sized companies that are not the targets of shareholder proposals and have less frequent challenges on compensation issues and director issues in general, I would say they're going to find in the years ahead that having independent director participation is going to be an important part of their overall long-term strategy for the same reasons that their key shareholders, not only their existing shareholders, but attracting new shareholders, that the role of the board and the competency of the board that can be articulated through these engagements will be increasingly important.
Now, let me ask you about the topics that they're currently covering, because you mentioned that shareholder proposals are driving a lot of these, and shareholder proposals tend to be on ESG topics, governance topics, social topics, environmental topics. How much of the discussion with the independent directors is taking place on ESG topics versus sort of core business?
I would say the vast majority is on ESG topics. There certainly is a component of how the board oversees long-term strategy, and more importantly, how a particular ESG topic ties in with long-term strategy. So that's certainly an overlying subject area, but the general focus of these engagements is on sustainability practices, whether it's diversity and inclusion or environmental impact. It's on governance practices, board composition, workforce diversity, independence of the board, compensation. So those tend to be the primary focal areas. I should add to that the individuals at the investors who the directors are speaking with most often are not the portfolio managers and analysts. They are the stewardship team members at these respective firms, including at many of the big passive quant firms that really don't even have portfolio managers or analysts with whom to engage with. So you're speaking at the investors with individuals that are not really focused on investment as much as they're focused on risk. And I view them as risk managers. So and that's really their motivation for wanting to hear from the directors, right? Because they're not making buy and sell decisions here. They're assessing risk, and how better to assess risk than to speak to individuals who are overseeing risk for a particular company.
Right, although it does seem to me as if this is going to need to evolve because as sustainability becomes more embedded in companies' business strategies, and those strategies are not just about mitigating risk, they're about seizing opportunities. So using sustainability as a competitive differentiator to attract talent, to develop new products and services. It seems like the discussion relating to environmental and social and other sustainability issues is going to need to move from risk toward opportunity. And maybe there needs to be a little evolution in the agendas for these discussions and even the attendees in these discussions.
Yeah, hallelujah, Paul. Absolutely. Not only, and frankly, I put a lot of this burden on the investors, right? So this is relatively new for many of them as well. You know, it wasn't that long ago that many of these big asset managers were abstaining on these shareholder proposals, not interested, not only in not voting on them, but not engaging on them. They've now jumped in with both feet, right? And they've now said that these are critical topics, but with that comes a certain responsibility for them to invest resources to really understand the content and how it ties in with strategy. So what I anticipate in the years ahead is that the shareholders are going to have to keep stepping up their games, right? It's not only around them demanding certain disclosures and sort of checking the box of, okay, we engage with this company or that company, but they're going to have to develop a much more sophisticated understanding and appreciation for the nuances of all of these, what are oftentimes complex issues, and how they drive either risks or opportunities for a particular company. So it's interesting, right? Because we were just saying how these individuals right now are not really thinking like investment managers, they're thinking like risk managers. But as they become more sophisticated and as they appreciate the content and develop their expertise, that will change as well. And that to me is all for the good. We're in a really challenging dynamic right now because the companies, of course, they understand these topics. They may be struggling with disclosure and reporting and things of that nature, but they understand it. The individuals on the other side of the conversation are still at a 10,000 foot level from my observation. And that's understandable right now, but it creates a real challenging dynamic that over time I think will improve.
Yeah, because it, for both sides to get the most out of the conversation, right? You want them both to understand the integration of sustainability issues with the business and how it's different at each company.
That's right. And I think you and I are both very much strong advocates for what I would call a constructive marketplace, right? These are really important topics. They cannot be treated in a cavalier way. And both ends of that relationship have to do their part. Companies, both management as well as directors, have to do their part in terms of not only the oversight and the execution, but the disclosure. But the shareholders have to do their part too. They have to really invest the resources, learn this, develop industry and company expertise so that the engagements really continue to be productive and lead to constructive outcomes.
So Bill, you talked a bit about some of the benefits that companies can have by putting their directors in front of their shareholders in terms of establishing credibility and building a relationship with investors, which is awfully important. What are some of the other benefits that the company receives by having the direct engagement between board members and their shareholders, and maybe some of the downsides, the risks as well?
So in addition to the ones you mentioned, I have found very consistently that directors get a lot of value from hearing firsthand from shareholders and then bringing that experience and that feedback back to their colleagues on the board. And as opposed to it being communicated and oftentimes filtered through management, that there is a value to directors hearing it directly from the shareholders. I also see these engagements as part of a longer term activism strategy, that if a company were to ever find itself in a more existential threat in terms of a proxy contest, a hostile suit, or something of that nature, that the relationships that directors have built with their key shareholders through, call it ESG focused engagements and relationship building, is incredibly valuable in those more contentious situations. And if directors wait to speak with their key shareholders until after that hostile event is upon them, it's too late, right? There's no credibility there. So for directors and boards that have made the effort to establish that credibility in advance of a hostile situation, either A, they can avoid it from happening in the first place, or B, if they're much more likely to be successful if they've done so.
And that's another reason why smaller and mid-cap companies may want to get into the game here, because actually, while they don't get the headlines, the vast majority of shareholder activism with the big A, where you're trying to throw out the board or change the strategy, happens at smaller and mid-cap companies. And so that's one reason among others why more companies may want to get into this.
100% correct. And it's something we try to preach to those companies. Of course, they are resource challenged in some cases, and directors at smaller mid-caps, they're familiar with this type of activism from a distance, but trying to compel them to sort of think proactively about that can be a challenge. But I think it's definitely happening, and I think it'll become, as I said, more regular. Yeah, so in terms of risk, so of course, and I know been on enough of these conversations with mention it to members of management that to consider an independent director participating, and you can just see the angst and agita that is being felt. But that's the reality, and I think I understand that this was not part of the job description of a director a number of years ago, but times change and roles and responsibilities change with it, and I think everyone, directors and officers together, have to appreciate that we're in a different era now. So the first step and the risk is that if a board does not have an individual who holds a leadership position at the board level, so whether it's a chair or lead director, independent chair, or chair of a key committee, if that individual is not up for whatever reason, up to the task of speaking with a shareholder, that's a potential problem. The other risk that we've seen is when a director is perhaps overconfident in speaking with a shareholder and is not well prepared. And as I mentioned earlier, these types of conversations are a little different than speaking with a traditional shareholder through an IR effort. So directors really have to be well prepared. And then the last risk I would say is, one of the primary objectives of these engagements is to demonstrate the robustness of the independent directors in any of these areas. But during conversations, if maybe an independent director is on, but is too tepid in comments or deferring too much to management, particularly when asked questions around how the board is performing its duties, or if a CEO is being overly aggressive in stepping in front of that director to answer those questions. You're really undermining one of the primary objectives of this engagement. So it's extremely important to be well prepared and to really think through who's participating from the company, and where is that line of demarcation, right? And management needs to understand any question that is directed at the board. How is the board overseeing this or doing that, or how did they arrive at this decision? That's really critical that independent director take the lead in answering that question. And similarly, the director can defer to members of management when there's a question that's really granular around strategy or operations.
No, that's really helpful. And it seems to me, based on what you're saying, that it's probably a good practice not to just put your directors through a crash course a week or two before the session, that developing fluency in ESG issues is something to be done over time and well in advance.
No, for sure. And one really positive development we've seen is that more and more companies now have identified sustainability officers, whether by title or by responsibilities. And those individuals are more regularly reporting up to a particular committee of the board. And that is incredibly important to keeping the directors, just what you said, Paul, informed and educated. They're asking questions. And so the subject area of these shareholder engagements is not going to be new territory for them.
If you're interested in this content from the Conference Board's ESG Center, you won't want to miss our webcast on one of the most significant workplace reforms in the last 50 years. Under a new law, employers would be prohibited from requiring workers to settle discrimination and harassment claims through arbitration. Instead, employees would have the choice to file suit in court with their own legal representation. Join our webcast on March 30th at 11 a.m. Eastern to hear from the people who actually wrote this bipartisan legislation: Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, Congressman Ken Buck of Colorado, and Gretchen Carlson, the woman whose lawsuit helped to ignite the Me Too movement, will join Paul Washington, head of our ESG Center, for a discussion of this landmark law. You'll find out what companies should consider doing now and in the future to create a safe and harassment-free environment. We'll also cover what's next as it relates to federal and state legislation. Join us this Wednesday, March 30th at 11 a.m. Eastern. Can't make it? You can watch this important webcast on demand at conference-board.org.
How do companies figure out which investors their directors are going to meet with? Do companies have criteria and policies these days sort of governing this, or is it really still done in a sort of ad hoc way?
It's more than ad hoc, but I would say I would describe it as circumstance specific, that you assess the need and the impact of director participation in any given year based on what are the expected challenges, what happened in prior years. For a lot of shareholders, they're not seeking to speak with directors every year. Sometimes it's every other year or every couple years, especially if things with a particular company are stable. From the company standpoint, I would say most target a top 5 to 10 shareholders for independent director participation. But again, if there's a more challenging dynamic at play, if a company is going through a crisis or significant changes at the board level and in the company's strategic vision, then it may be critical to go deeper. So, and that's one thing whether it's with directors or not, I fear with a lot of companies that since the exercise of engagement has become pretty normal, that it just is it's a rote exercise that okay, it's time to engage again. Let's check that box, and it's really important that each cycle, whether it's in advance of an annual meeting or during the quote unquote off season, that there's some thought given to what are we trying to achieve, right? Every engagement opportunity should be with a purpose. It shouldn't just be to check the box and say, okay, we did that. And I understand from the company's perspective, sometimes they get that sense from the shareholders that the shareholders are checking the box. They're just saying, okay, I spoke with that portfolio company, and that I appreciate that frustration. But companies have to stay at it, and they have to still think about this in a strategic way. And what do we want to accomplish, both in terms of immediate objectives as well as longer term. And I think that typically shapes the engagement strategy, both for management and board participation.
That's a really important point. You made me think of another benefit that companies can have by engaging an independent director. It's actually to get in the door with your shareholders.
Yes, that particularly for certain firms, that increases the likelihood that they'll accept an engagement for sure.
Are there best practices when it comes to disclosure about director engagement in this area?
There's typically a reference to it. So to take your example, so we talked to, whatever our top 50 or top 75 representing X% of outstanding. Our independent chair joined us for the 5 to 10 of the largest shareholders, or something to that effect. That's becoming more regular. I'm not as hung up on the numbers for the reason I said earlier, that year to year, the scope and intensity of the engagement effort is going to change. I actually think the content of the discussions is as critical. And by that, I mean, what topics were covered? What did you talk about with your key shareholders? What were they interested in? How did the board respond to the feedback that they heard? When a shareholder proposal gets majority support, right, there's a more explicit burden on a board to demonstrate responsiveness. When Say on Pay fails to get majority support, there's a more expected disclosure around how the comp committee responded. But it should not only be in those circumstances that you're addressing board responsiveness as shareholder feedback. Even in years when all the votes are high and there are no contentious issues, it's still important to be speaking with some key shareholders on relevant topics. And then, to me, it's like, you're doing a lot of good things. Why not show it off, right? You should be talking around the content, what subjects were discussed, and to the extent that it led to either some enhanced disclosure or some additional evaluation by the board. To me, that just goes to their credibility. I'm sure you've probably heard me say this before. I apologize if I'm repeating it, but the election of directors is a very unique issue, right? When shareholders vote on pretty much any other proposal, there's a fair amount of clarity around what the shareholders are voting on. But the election of directors is really a perception vote, right? That no one's in the boardroom. There's no cameras there. There's no reality TV shows yet. So how do shareholders assess the director's performance, right? And of course, there was a time where if a company's stock price was doing well, then it was presumed that the board was doing its job. Those days obviously are long gone. So for better or worse, the board has a responsibility to shape that perception as much as they can in a positive way. And this type of disclosure around engagement and around their efforts to respond to shareholder feedback is going to really enhance that perception and their credibility.
Right. And it's somewhat similar to disclosure you can make regarding board self-evaluations.
It's a great point, Paul, and I will tell you that there definitely is that perception in the marketplace that the evaluation is really, it's not a serious exercise that boards take. So yes, in appreciating that there may be sensitive topics and you don't want to be calling out any particular director for anything, but in terms of higher level areas that the evaluation was focused on, any actions the board took in response, understanding, again, there may be some sensitive topics. The more the board can say about that, absolutely furthers that objective.
So the traditional job description of a director was to decide, to oversee, and to advise. And then increasingly, it's becoming to engage particularly with shareholders. Are you seeing directors also engaging with employees or with communities, with other stakeholders?
For sure. And to be fair, I think at a lot of companies, directors did that to an extent already. So I don't want to suggest that this is a new phenomenon that just started. But I would say, from my observation, as you mentioned at the outset, how old I am. So from my observation over the years, that that directors are more conscious of finding opportunities to visit locations, to speak with individuals within the operations of a company, and to do so in a less managed way, where they're just getting a tour of a facility or something, but where they can actually have conversations. I think they are finding a lot of value in doing that, and to the extent that they are now increasingly responsible for really understanding issues around employees, whether it's again around diversity and inclusion or certain benefits, safety measures, all the issues around supply chain. I think that's becoming a more vital role for directors. In terms of community and customers, other stakeholders, I would say that's also happening, especially with the communities. I think the customer area is less common, but communities in which companies operate, having directors have a firsthand experience, just as I said with the engagement, firsthand knowledge of speaking with shareholders, firsthand experience of speaking to community leaders and members in which they operate, is only going to inform their decision making as directors. One mantra that I have is, I may agree or disagree with any particular board decision, but the one thing I've always felt strongly about is that they make an informed decision and they have all the right information. And so these types of opportunities for them to connect with a range of stakeholders really serves that purpose. And I think it's going to just help them manage these types of risks going forward.
Right. And because they're making decisions, boards these days are making decisions are a wider array of topics than ever before, and taking into account a multi-stakeholder environment. And that shift is definitely underway. It's up to each company to decide how far it wants to be on the sort of stockholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism spectrum, but there clearly is a shift underway. And that means that directors need to be more broadly informed, not only on the what, but also on the who or the whom.
For sure. And going back to my comment about perception, right? There's a perception that everything the board hears is filtered through the CEO, right? The CEO sort of manages what the board knows and doesn't know. And obviously, there has to be some effort to streamline the information to the board. I'm not suggesting you don't have to do that. But to your point, there are areas of increased focus for directors that are clearly benefited from them having firsthand experience. And I think management and the board have to work together to give directors that knowledge.
So look, you've given companies and investors alike a lot of great advice here. Just as we conclude, I'd just like to ask you your main piece of advice, perhaps for a board that hasn't done much in the way of director-shareholder direct engagement, right? What's your main advice for them?
My main advice is to embrace the strategy. It doesn't have to be overwhelming. If you're a smaller mid-cap company, we're not saying you have to do everything that a mega cap company does, but there's a strategy that's going to serve you well over the long term that should be embraced and implemented. And it can be done in an incremental and thoughtful way. But the days of being able to quote unquote fly below the radar are gone, right? Or you can try it, but it comes with great peril and risk. And it's clearly not going to serve you well. I appreciate the challenges that smaller mid-sized companies have with resources, but I think there's a way to implement these types of strategies in a way that can work within that framework. But there has to be buy-in. There has to be buy-in from the board, from management. I will tell you, over the last, say, 2 years, Paul, we've worked with more small and mid-cap companies than ever before. For many years, the vast majority of our clientele were those large and mega cap companies for the activism reasons I mentioned earlier. So we are definitely seeing that the small and mid-sized companies are seeing the need. I can absolutely recognize from right away when companies are struggling, like just where to start, where do I begin with this? And there are clear strategies that you can implement to do that, but just ignoring it is I just don't see much benefit to that.
Got it. Well, look, that's enormously helpful. So thanks, Bill. This has been a really terrific and enlightening discussion, and I want to thank everyone for listening. I'd encourage you to go to tcb.org, our website, and you'll see a recent report we put out there on the 2022 proxy season that discusses the issues such as director engagement with investors and a whole lot of other subjects that you may find interesting. You can also find additional podcasts and webcasts and blogs relating to all things corporate governance and ESG at tcb.org. So thanks again, Bill. Great to spend time with you. You look younger at the end of this podcast than you did at the beginning. And everyone listening just has to take my word for that.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity and great to speak with you, Paul.
Okay, take care.
This has been ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.